Texas left out in the cold. What's behind the state's power grid failure as another storm descends? Biden says that July is the new vaccine endgame. And the biggest movie in the world? It's something you've probably never heard of. Wednesday Need to Know. Let's go. Good morning, everybody. This is Cheddar's Need to Know podcast for Wednesday, February 17th. I'm Carlo Versano here once again with my brother from another mother,
yes.
Baker Machado. Baker, today's Lent, man. Did you get all your sins done out of the way?
I was still partying from Fat Tuesday last night, just raging, looking for that baby in the cake last night, Carlo. Could not find it. I don't know what you've decided to give up for Lent. In the past, I always felt like, even though I have to admit, I'm not Catholic, but my friends who were Catholic, I was always jealous of them being able to give up something, so I would do something stupid like, I'm not going to have soda for, a little while, or I'm not going to, have mac and cheese for a while.
Yeah.
Then I just kind of gave up, trying to figure out what to give up for Lent.
Well, what am I giving? For me, I think I'm giving up the will to live.
Sure. Oh, yes. Yeah, this seems like a perfect time. Just be like, you know what? I'm cashing in. See you later.
Cash in my check. Okay.
Yeah, start while you're ahead. Carlo, we got to start today with the same story we started with yesterday, the awful situation that's happening down south. Nearly 3 million Texas residents are now going 48 hours without any power during a very historic cold snap. I don't know if you know this, Carlo. No power means zero heat. The record cold temperatures in the state's power grid, which relies mostly on natural gas, was not weatherized to prepare for temperatures in the single digits. I think it's -2 degrees right now in Dallas-Fort Worth. The state's main utility says the disruption was because most of the coal, the nuclear, and gas infrastructure was forced offline, and it doesn't know when the outages will end, but it could potentially be days, more days for these people down south. At least 20 people so far have died across the country from the far-reaching storm, and another system is now descending on the middle part of the country that will just add even more, Carlo, to this mess that we're seeing.
Baker, you mentioned that Wall Street Journal op-ed yesterday morning about the wind turbines that froze over. Sure enough, that became sort of the genesis of this right-wing media move yesterday. They really moved on a dime to sort of cast the blame for this entire mess in Texas on green energy. So let's do a little debunking, okay? 3/4 of Texas power comes from coal or natural gas.
Yes,
doesn't come from wind. The fact that those plants weren't winterized, weren't weatherized, combined with this deregulated grid that Texas has, which emphasizes cheap prices over reliable service. Those are the reasons for what we're seeing. So let's just be clear about that. So if you're in Texas and you want to be mad at somebody for why it's going to be day 3 of you not being able to heat your home during the coldest week in 100 years, be mad at your state politicians. People like Greg Abbott, Ted Cruz, John Cornyn. These are among the most useless politicians in America. They spend all their time, when they're not trying to actually overthrow the government, tweeting memes about AOC or kissing Donald Trump's ass rather than actually trying to govern the second most populous state in America. I mean, Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, he actually had the gall to go on Sean Hannity on Fox News last night when millions of his constituents are literally freezing. And he's on freaking Fox News primetime to talk about how this is an example of why the Green New Deal is just bad policy. I mean, that unbelievably sickening. And, every news event now, Baker, it just gets filtered through these culture war talking points and fed to us like slop for us. We're like these little piggies and we just get the slop for the day. It's so tiring. I'm so frustrated by it. Not everything has to be mapped onto some previously held belief you have. But you know what? Actually, and I'm sorry to go off on a heater already this morning.
I like this. I love when you get so riled up on an issue like this.
I actually want to take everything I just said back because I'm now actually being a hypocrite. I have always said on this podcast that one of the worst parts of the Trump presidency to me was that he made everything into this red state versus blue state fight. Right? Especially when it came to the pandemic, it was all red states versus blue states. Who deserves what, and I'm now starting to do that, and I don't want to do that. And what was great to see yesterday from the White House? Nothing. Because you know what Biden did? President Biden signed a federal emergency declaration for Texas. That's it. It didn't come with some Maggie Haberman story in the New York Times about how he first asked why Texas deserved aid because they didn't vote for him. He
Right?
wasn't
Remember?
pressured into doing it. He just did it, right? Because Texas is part of this country and they need help. And
Right.
that was damn refreshing to see.
You remember President Trump and his fights he would have with Andrew Cuomo. There was a time Trump said that the state of New York probably wasn't going to get coronavirus vaccines because
Yeah.
he didn't like Andrew Cuomo. So you're right, that is refreshing. I do want to mention one other thing here, and this is, misinformation and disinformation encapsulates so much of our politics, and we saw it during the election. Now we're seeing disinformation infiltrate when people need information and reliable information more than ever. It seems like what's happening right now in Texas, Carlo, is a perfect storm of everything. And even some reports out there say some of the natural clean energy is a small part of all of this, but the most of this is coming from the coal-powered stuff. It's a perfect storm of everything essentially freezing over. And you're absolutely right. If you're a person that lives in Texas right now who has not had heat for days, there are reports, Carlo, of hundreds of carbon monoxide poisonings in people's houses because they're bringing some sort of heater equipment inside of their house, but they're not having proper ventilation. A woman and her family died because their fire in their house got out of control because they were trying to heat their house. It is just awful news across the board. And then it just shows when disinformation is added to the top of it, then you're essentially pulling people against each other in a moment where they need the most reliable information possible.
Well, Baker, I'm glad you said that because I think one of the things, we talk now every couple of months almost. It feels like there's a once in 100-year weather event, right? Obviously, like this has to do with climate change. Like this is there's going to be more of these sorts of things happening. And we have to be prepared for that. And we have to be prepared to be in a media ecosystem where we're not everything, like I said, gets filtered through this like sort of like political environment where it's just about, feeling like you're on the right side or wrong side, right?
Well, in Texas, the thing that's going to be fascinating for the rest of the year for Texas is they're having issues right now with heat. What happens in the summer when the temperatures get over 100 degrees and everybody's turning on their air conditioners all at once? Will the power grid once again be overstrained as a result? This is going to be an issue you're going to see not just in Texas, but every state and every country on this planet as temperatures continue to go in these very extreme ways. And people are using their heat and electricity in more ways possible. Are you going to see the power grids as a result get stretched to the bare bones as a result?
Right.
All right, let's move
Also,
on.
I mean, one thing hopefully what this will do is add to some sense of need for an infrastructure bill when the COVID stimulus is all done, because I think that's one thing that everybody in this country can get behind, which is that we need an investment in our infrastructure in a serious way.
And by the way, I'm glad you mentioned that because that is one issue Joe Biden in particular thinks he's going to get massive bipartisan compromise on. Republicans have said forever, and there was this running joke in Washington forever that every week was Infrastructure Week during the Trump years. A lot of people are actually hoping that Infrastructure Week actually happens during this administration. I mentioned Joe Biden. I want to talk about his event he had last night. He had a CNN town hall, and he said that every American who wants a vaccine will be able to get one, Carlo, by the end of July, a much more optimistic timeline than he had suggested just last week. Now, FEMA has opened the very first federal mass vaccination sites in Oakland and Los Angeles. This, as the White House said, the weekly supply being sent to states will now get a bump from 11 million to 13.5 million doses. Last night was really fascinating, Carlo, because he didn't put any specific timelines on a lot of things. He said, listen, I'm hoping that we can do things here. But again, it's all completely contingent on, will we have enough vaccines to get people out? Will basically people continue to wear masks and social distance? There was a question last night about when would we go back to normal? When would we go back to not having to wear masks, not having to worry about social distancing? And Biden said, listen, my hope is that by this time next year, everything will be back to normal, but that is completely contingent on us doing our role as citizens, making sure that we're doing our part, because then we will get back to that normal.
The thing about July, that was definitely the headline out of that, because he had previously said that he thought by the end of July there would be enough doses for everybody. But now he's saying that pretty much he thinks that the logistical hurdles are going to be lessened to the point where it's not just that the vaccine for you will exist on a shelf somewhere, but you will actually be able to go get the jab, just without having to jump through a bunch of hoops. So that's important. It's not just us, by the way, seeing these significant plunges in COVID. There's really good news all around. The World Health Organization says cases were down worldwide by 16% last week. In some places like India, they're down really big. It's actually incredible. They actually probably have some amount of herd immunity there. That's probably why we're seeing that. But this gives us hope, right? That we're going to be able to buy some time, especially in the developing world, for these vaccination efforts to take hold. If their emergency rooms and ICUs aren't overflowing with COVID patients, maybe we can start to use the hospitals to get some of these shots into arms. And speaking of the hospitals, I sort of had a question for the audience here, because I know that we have some nurses and some doctors who listen. So I'm curious, just like what the scene is, because it's obvious, it's really hard to know because of all the HIPAA rules. We don't really get that much information inside hospitals. But I'm curious, like, how many ICU nurses are working now versus a couple months ago? Are these promising numbers being reflected on the front lines, right? Are nurses working 60 hours a week, or are they getting a little bit of time off? So I'm just, if you work in a hospital, I know you can't violate HIPAA rules, but I would be curious to hear that.
One other thing, Carlo, you had mentioned yesterday, you had a sort of $100 bet with your friend to see if you both would be able to get the vaccine before Memorial Day. It's interesting because Dr. Fauci originally had said April was essentially going to be open season, that if you wanted to get a vaccine in the month of April, you would likely be able to get one. Now they're sort of tamping that down a little bit. Now Dr. Fauci essentially is saying maybe May and June will essentially now be open season. So my hope is, now that my fingers are crossed, that you'll be able to get your vaccine by Memorial Day. I still think you'll be able to, but Dr. Fauci clearly is now trying to push a little bit more of a realistic timeline on this.
Well, I think him saying open season was probably not a great word choice, because that makes it just sounds like there's just going to be this
everybody
mad
go
rush.
Yes.
Right. And there's still going to be like logistics that we have to. I don't think you're ever going to be able to just show up and get a shot. You're going to have to fill out some forms, and you're going to have to go through some Byzantine website probably. But look, I still think that spring. I think that we're in a good place. And whether it's April, whether it's May, whether it's June, like we are headed in a very good direction. Let's not forget that.
I have dreams of spring where at least we're vaccinated in my house. I should note my husband, who is the biggest hypochondriac ever for the last year and a half, has been consumed with this idea he's going to get COVID. He is getting the vaccine in 2 weeks. He's getting it here in New York City, and the mood.
Fantastic.
And it's amazing news. It's really, really good. I'm jealous. I'm not getting it also, but the entire mood of our house has completely changed, Carlo, because you have to think COVID has consumed every part of our brain, and how we interact with people, how we go to the grocery store, how we eat, how we live, everything. So not having that, yes, we still have to think about it, but the idea that light is now essentially at the end of the tunnel is a very refreshing feeling. For the first time yesterday, my husband and I don't think we even had a conversation about COVID, because he just seems so much more relaxed knowing that the end was coming. And that's going to be a feeling all of us are going to have, especially in the spring, which, by the way, hopefully the weather is a lot nicer, and we're all like, yay, it's nice outside, and I'm not going to get COVID. How great. Carlo, there's another...
Roaring 20s, here we come.
Yeah, exactly. Carlo, there's another fascinating health story to all of this, and I'm sure a lot of people are thinking it's winter time. This is typically the flu season. So a lot of people are probably thinking, where is the flu in all of this? Well, last winter, you might forget, 405,000 Americans were hospitalized with the flu. This winter, that same number, 165. 165 total. The flu season has been almost non-existent this year, and it's really hard to figure out why. Millions of school children, which are usually the super spreaders of all super spreaders, they've been home doing virtual learning. The rest of us, we're wearing masks, we're social distancing. Everything we've been doing to stop COVID has basically had the same effect eradicating the flu, at least so far this year. So you almost had to think, are we all going to be wearing masks, on a continual basis just because the flu numbers also completely falling down as well?
Well, it's interesting, right? I think you mean it's not hard to figure out why, right?
Yes,
because
we
know why. Yeah,
yes, we know why. Yes.
Because of all of the mitigation efforts. And look, I think the good news is that our collective experience with COVID means that society is going to be able to do a much better job stopping a future flu pandemic, for instance, in its
Well, I
tracks,
hope
because
so.
we know what works now, right? So if flu is really out of control, maybe people will start putting on masks. They'll start social distancing on their own. I think that is potentially one of the great things that could
Totally.
come from this. The bad news, of course, is that people are going to be a lot more susceptible to the flu when flu season comes back around next year, because they didn't get it this year. But still, the good outweighing the bad there for sure.
But I don't know if you watched John Oliver this last weekend. It was his first episode he's done in a few months, and it was very depressing, Carlo. I'll tell you this much, because it was very depressing. Because his whole essential thesis was, have we and will we as a population learn from the mistakes that we made during COVID for the next pandemic that potentially could happen down the road? And the answer is probably maybe no, that we might go back to our original same habits that we used to do before COVID, and then all of a sudden the infrastructure is not built for us to sustain the next potentially worse pandemic. My hope is that with this, and especially now that we're seeing flu numbers also start to go down, that a lot of us will start to take an extra little bit of caution when it comes to, interactions with others and other things, that all of a sudden the next pandemic isn't as severe as this was. Because you have to think, this has cost us trillions of dollars, and so many people's lives have been lost as a result of this. You don't want to see this happen again.
No, I mean, I think some of the things that are, first of all, are people ever going to shake hands again?
Oh, God,
I'm down with the elbow
great
bump.
question. Yeah, I'm
down
me too.
with the
It's
elbow
much easier.
bump, man. Totally. It's much easier. I think that, this idea of like going to work sick just because you want to like show people that you're a hard worker, hopefully that can go out the window. I mean, there are some good things that could come from this, right?
Such a good point. Carlo, I do want to go back to that CNN town hall last night. By the way, this was President Biden's first official trip as president in terms of what town hall last night, and it really gave him a chance to show off his personal style of politics. The headline, of course, was his comment about vaccine availability in July that we talked about, but he was really there at the end of the day to pitch that $1.9 trillion stimulus bill, essentially saying, quote, "Now is the time to go big." Now, a lot of time was spent on school reopenings. I'm going to talk about that in a moment, because Joe Biden contradicted his press secretary and said that his goal was for most schools to be open full-time by the end of his first 100 days, rather than at least one day a week, which had been the White House's official line. The reason, Carlo, this is going to be fascinating from a political standpoint, you're already seeing Republicans campaign on opening the schools. You have parents who are exasperated and pushed essentially to the brink to get their kids out of the house. They don't care who is running for office, as long as they get their kids in school, get them there. This potentially, Republicans think that this is going to be a big wedge issue that is going to work in their favor in their attempt to take back the House in 2022, given the fact that Democrats and the Biden administration have a much more close relationship with teachers' unions, who have been pushing these schools to remain closed until the teachers can get vaccinated. So politically, Joe Biden has tried to really sort of clean this mess up, which is why you saw him last night contradict his press secretary, Jen Psaki.
Yes, I mean, look, the guy is a good politician. So Biden refused to also offer any thoughts on impeachment of Trump during the town hall last night.
His name last night.
Well, he referred to him as, quote, the former guy.
Yeah.
And basically said, "I'm sick of talking about Trump." So next question. I hesitate to say this because I don't want to sound like I'm, a bag holder for the Democrats. In fact, I have zero allegiance to the Democratic Party, despite
we
what
don't
you
have
may
allegiance
think.
to anybody.
Yes, but I think Biden has been playing everything exactly right, and I think it shows you that he is. This is the reason. Look, this is the reason why the guy has been around for so long, is because he knows how to play the game of politics. He sees the school reopening issue as becoming a wedge issue, like you said, and he's trying to get ahead of that. He's not taking the media's bait on Trump. He's focusing on the pandemic to the exclusion of everything else, and that's going to work for him, because that is what people want to hear, right? They don't want to hear his thoughts on the impeachment of Donald Trump or whatever Trump said about Mitch McConnell last night.
Matter.
They want to hear about when are my kids going back to school?
Yep.
Even though the ironic thing, of course, is that the school issue is not a federal issue, right? Biden
he doesn't have
declare
control over that.
Open.
But he's the face of the country, and when people want somebody to blame, obviously that's the first person that they're going to go to. Carlo, you're absolutely right, and this is why presidential historians say, was Joe Biden and his 40-plus years of experience, was he built for this moment? You have to think, when we elect presidents, typically we don't like typical Washington politicians that have been there forever. If you look at all of the past presidents we've had, Donald Trump, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, they're all people that are not from Washington. They're not creatures of Washington. We as Americans don't like typically voting for Washington insiders, but Joe Biden clearly is the exception here, and he used his 8 years as vice president to his advantage. And in many ways, you have to think if another person, let's say it was Pete Buttigieg or somebody else, won the nomination and won the presidency, and they were dealing with Donald Trump not cooperating with them, giving them information when it came to the transition hands-off of information that is critical to making your administration work, you would think that that would stymie the first couple days, maybe even the first 100 days of any new administration. But the fact that Joe Biden already knows how this all works and this all operates, a clear advantage for him.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Carlo, I want to talk about the price of Bitcoin now, Carlo. It has actually just been crushing it. It soared past $50,000 for the first time, paring back some of those gains eventually later on the day. The digital coin up some 75% so far this year. The rally's been helped along by new institutional interest in crypto. That's because we've been seeing a lot of big names like MasterCard, Morgan Stanley, all warming up to the idea of digital currencies that are not backed by the government. But the sustained rally also suggests that some of the same retail investors that powered Bitcoin's last bull run in 2017 are coming back, buying and holding the asset here for the long run. I mean, Carlo, the oldest bank in the country, Bank of New York Mellon, which basically, from the Stagecoach days, they are now doing Bitcoin as well. And it's fascinating because if you talk to different investors out there, some believe, listen, this Bitcoin run can continue as more big companies continue to get into this. The worry, though, that we've seen from other investors is this basically what we saw with the dot-com bubble as well? Is this something that is going to burst, and so many people who have been putting so much money into this are going to feel the effects of this? This is a tough position to be in.
I mean, that's sort of where my head is. I mean, I want to ask the world's dumbest question, especially coming from a journalist that works for a financial news outlet. So I'll probably regret this.
Don't worry, I ask dumb questions all day.
Here's the thing that I don't understand about Bitcoin. What is its inherent value? If it's not backed by a physical commodity like gold or silver or fiat currency or like a government, like our fiat currency is, what keeps it from falling to zero when there's the next crash, which is going to happen?
That's the worry.
Believe it or not, the stock market doesn't always go up. It may feel like it does, but if you're new to the world, it will eventually go down. And I wouldn't want to be holding a ton of Bitcoin when that happens. So I don't know. Maybe somebody can explain that to me. I don't get it.
No, I agree. Carlo, have you seen Detective Chinatown 3? By the way, one of my favorites. I missed the first two, but I heard the third one is pretty good. But apparently, this movie, Detective Chinatown 3, just had the biggest box office opening of all time over the weekend. The third installment of the Chinese buddy comedy series made $397 million in its first weekend in China, beating out the former single market record, which was the Avengers Endgame in North America, which only had about $40 million. This is a story, Carlo, that Hollywood is seething over because of the closures of all of the theaters. For the first time, I think last year or it's 2019, it was the first time ever China had a bigger box office number than the United States did. The United States has always been essentially the king of the box office, but because theaters have been closed and then all of a sudden the distribution production companies are either taking their films to streaming platforms like HBO Max or they're holding on to them until everything starts to open up. The result of that is none of these films in Hollywood are making any money whatsoever, which is why you're seeing Detective Chinatown 3 essentially be the biggest movie of the last year.
Well, that's the thing, right? What's incredible is that it's a Chinese movie. It's not a big Hollywood movie. Usually these big openings in China are Marvel movies like Avengers or big Hollywood produced blockbusters. We've been exporting our culture to countries like China for decades, and they've been eating it up. Now they're becoming less reliant on it, which is going to add to this sort of sense of nationalism that's sweeping that country. But I think the real reason for this is you have first of all, it's Lunar New Year in China, right? So you've got millions of people who are usually traveling. Staying home because you can't really travel in China, even though they've essentially beaten the virus. So China's consumers are starting to open their wallets. There's a lot of Chinese consumers. When they do that, you get numbers like this, which of course ends up powering this economic boom, which is going to end up overtaking the U.S. in terms of GDP probably within the next 2 or 3 years. So it's a fascinating sort of thing to watch happen in real time. But
Carlo,
I don't think I'll be seeing this.
No, but Carlo, just to add a little cherry to all of this, because of a dumpster fire we had in 2020, do you know what the #1 movie at the box office was for all of 2020 here in the United States last year? Just take a guess.
Tenet.
No, you would think it, but no, Tenet, I think, was in the top 5. The #1 movie in the United States last year, Bad Boys for Life, only $204 million. Wow. Just shows you how much
it came
Hollywood...
out before COVID.
Yeah, exactly, because it came
why?
out literally the month before COVID. That's the only reason. So this just shows why Hollywood is so desperate to get the movies back out into theaters, for us to go back to these theaters, because nobody wants Bad Boys for Life to be the #1 movie ever again.
Will Smith and Martin Lawrence probably do.
Yes, boy, exactly.
All right, Baker. Good stuff. Thank you for joining us again today. All right, guys. That is what you need to know for, what day is today? Wednesday, February 7th.